Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 21, Golgari Midrange Removal. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today we will be covering my strategy for drafting Golgari, or Black-Green, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. Before the set was released, I thought Golgari was going to be the early leader, since Black and Green looked so strong. We quickly learned that it was kind of difficult to figure out what Golgari is trying to do. At the end of the set, it is the fourth least drafted archetype and has the second worst win rate, following Simic, on 17 lands. Golgari's theme on Arena is Poison Victory, which is somewhat misleading and might be starting people off in the wrong direction. I've found Golgari to be similar to Simic in that it is more of a mid-range deck, but instead of oil synergies and stalling the game until you can play late-game bombs, it relies on having access to plenty of removal options to help push damage through, and it has a lot of similarities to Rakdos. My one and only Tier 1 common is Anoint with Affliction. As you will see, there are some toxic creatures I aim to play, but it is far from aiming to get a victory from Toxic. It's more like Toxic is a bonus that allows cards like Anoint to be a little bit better. At least some of the time. But I don't even aim to get my opponent corrupted. Generally, I avoid cards like Blightbelly Rat, the 2/2 for 2 with Toxic 1 which triggers Proliferate when it dies, and Pestilent Siphoner, the 1/1 Toxic Flyer for 2. I leave those cards for Orsov and Dimir, which care more about toxic counters. Instead, I approach Golgari like I do Rakdos and aim to get as much removal as I can. Anoint with Affliction is a great card, even just as a smother that exiles, and I'll take as many as I can get, even if I have to pick it up early on pick 3 or 4. Next up, we have a familiar face, Contagious Vorak, which is my one and only Tier 2 common. Since I'm leaning away from the toxic strategy, I almost always choose to find my 4th or 5th land over proliferating. In Golgari, I'm aiming to survive until my 4 and 5 cost cards use my removal to destroy their late game plays, and that's it. Keep it simple. Even if I have some cards with oil counters, the proliferation is generally not needed to make them function, and I'd rather take the land. This one is always one you have to take early, around 3 or 4. Now for Tier 3 and the real benefit of being in Golgari. There are a fair amount of cards that work in Golgari that don't really work in other strategies. Testament Bearer is my first Tier 3 common. The only other archetype that really wants to play it is Rakdos, so they wheel, and you can pick them up as late as pick 10. Like Rakdos, you are aiming to trade the board and have plenty of removal. Though this card does have some weaknesses that are worth mentioning, like being picked off by Ambulatory Edifice, Whispers of the Dross, Cinder/Ravager, etc. It does, however, often trade quite well, and it draws you a card when it does trade. So I've really enjoyed them, and the fact that they go late is something you can take advantage of in Golgari. My next Tier 3 common is Stinging Hivemaster. Also similar to Rakdos, if you're aiming to trade your board, it's nice that this leaves behind a 1/1 Might. The Toxic can be nice if you're running Anoint with Affliction, but once again, it's more of a bonus than the main theme. This is also a card that you can take late, not as late as Testament Bearer, but around pick 6 or 7. My next Tier 3 common is Tyrannic's Atrocity. In Rakdos, you have Furnace Strider, the 4/5 for 5 that can remove an oil counter to give something haste. In Golgari, you get a 4/4 that hits your opponent for 3 poison counters that can't give other creatures haste and has a double pip in green. I know, I'm really selling the archetype, but the upside is that this card tends to go late, and you can pick it up on pick 7 or 8. My next Tier 3 common is Ruthless Predation. Just like Rakdos, you want removal, and then some more removal. And Ruthless Predation is removal. It's definitely not the best removal, because it is prone to getting blown out for a 2-for-1, but it does go late for removal, around pick 4 or 5. My next tier 3 common is Lattice Blade Mantis. You don't care so much for the oil synergies as you would in Simic or Gruul, but a 5/4 Pseudo Vigilance for 4 is great in any mid-range deck. It can also be picked up late around pick 6 or 7. My last tier 3 common is Branch Blight Stalker. Once again, similar to Rakdos, this is kind of a replacement for Barbed Batterfist, but instead of leaving behind a useful equipment, you get Toxic 2 to sometimes hit Corrupted. The upside, it also goes late around pick 6 or 7. Now for the uncommons. My first tier 1 uncommon is Drowned Ichor. It's not as good in Golgari as it is in a toxic strategy like Orsov or Dimir, but it's better than it is in Rakdos. It's great removal, and some of the time you'll benefit off of getting your opponent corrupted. You'll want to grab it when you can because it does go early, around 2 or 3. My next tier 1 uncommon is Ambulatory Edifice. I love this card, and I still don't understand why it goes so late. There are so many useful targets to hit with this card, and I put it at least at tier 2 in every black archetype, but in Golgari I put it at tier 1. It's especially important in Golgari because you don't have the strongest selection of early plays, so a lot of time the 2-for-1ing with Ambulatory Edifice is what gets you back in the game. They also go late for an uncommon around pick 4 or 5. My last tier 1 uncommon is Cankerbloom. It's a 3/2 for 2 that can sack to remove a problematic threat like Urabrask's Forge, or some annoying enchantment removal on your Archfiend of the Dross. A lot of the set has gone like this for me. Turn 1 creature, turn 2 creature, turn 3 removal, turn 4 creature, turn 5 removal and a creature. If you can accomplish that, I feel like you win most of your games. With no fixing or filtering, it is definitely easier said than done. And Cankerbloom does get picked up around 3 or 4, so you'll want to grab them when you see them. My first tier 2 uncommon is Bilowas Skulldweller. This card is S tier in Orsov because you really need toxic 1-drops to make that archetype work, but it trades well in Golgari, and you care just enough about toxic that it's a nice little bonus. Even more so than in Celestia, I aim to win through damage, so you don't want a whole bunch of these, but at uncommon it's hard to get more than 2 anyway, and these get taken around 3 or 4. My last tier 2 uncommon is Infectious Bite. Like Drown and Ichor, the poison counter can be what you need to hit Corrupted, and maybe I've been a bit harsh on poison. You can win through a poison victory, I just don't think it should be your main plan. It's also another removal for your arsenal, and they do go quickly around 2 or 3 since they are the only green removal at uncommon and a superior option to Ruthless Predation. My first tier 3 uncommon is Sheoldred's Edict. Similar to Rakdos, the more removal you have, the better, and this is another removal option. You do have better removal options, but removal is removal at the end of the day. And as long as you have been trading to keep the board small, this card works pretty well. Even when you find yourself against white, you can still find ways to get value out of it some of the time. The upside is it goes late for an uncommon, around pick 4 or 5. My next tier 3 uncommon is Evolving Adaptive, a mythic level uncommon in both Gruul and Simic. It's just alright in Golgari. It's easy to get this to be a 3/3 for 1, but Golgari doesn't care about the oil counters as much as Gruul and Simic. It's still important to have early plays, and Golgari doesn't have the greatest selection at common, so I'm usually on the lookout for decent 1 and 2 drops at the uncommon level. The downside is it gets picked up around 2 or 3, so you'll have to take it early. My next tier 3 uncommon is Incubation Sac. It's better in Gruul because of oil synergies, but I think Golgari is its second best archetype. In Celestia, you want to be more aggressive, and in Simic, you are generally looking to go bigger, since you tend to kind of aim to create a board stall. But if you're aiming to trade the early plays and then use removal on anything above 4 toughness, like I suggest in Golgari, then this gives you a lot of 3/3 golems to throw at your opponent, which is important since trading and playing removal 1-for-1 tends to create small games where the 3/3s can really shine. It also goes late for an uncommon, around 4 or 5. My next tier 3 uncommon is Tyvar's Stand. It's better in every other green archetype, but it functions as yet another thing of removal, or sometimes to guard an important card like Glissa Sunslayer from removal. You have better removal options, but it can work in a pinch if you haven't seen the tier 1 and tier 2 removal. My next tier 3 uncommon is Armored Scrapgorger. I aim to have enough 4-drops in the deck like Lattice Blade Mantis and Testament Bearer that I can benefit off of including a Ramper on turn 2. The lack of oil synergies and Chimney Rabble makes it worse in Golgari than it is in Gruul, but I'll still happily take it, especially since, as I mentioned, I generally am in the market for decent 1 and 2 cost uncommons to fill my lower curve. The downside again is that you'll have to take it early because these guys disappear by pick 2 or pick 3. My 5th green tier 3 uncommon is Sylvok Battle Chair. Similar to Rakdos, despite all of your trading and removal, it is nice to have a way to seal the deal in case the board gets stalled out. Being able to repeatedly send a 5/5 or larger trampler at your opponent every turn is usually enough to eventually get your opponent's defenses to fall. It also goes late for an uncommon, around pick 5 or 6. My next tier 3 uncommon, and don't worry, there's only one more after this, is Necrogen Rot Priest. Looking at this long list of uncommons, one can see why we thought Golgari was going to be the best archetype. It has great options for removal and decent creatures, but the set turned out to be more about synergy. And speaking of synergy, I think Necrogen Rot Priest is at the root of a lot of problems in Golgari. I really think Toxic is a trap in Golgari, and with a signpost uncommon like this, I think it encourages a lot of people to go down the Toxic path. I still think it is worth picking up in my strategy, since you can give it Death Touch and it's a great defensive card. And you can pick it up late for an uncommon around pick 4 or 5. My last tier 3 uncommon is Atrax's Skitterfang. You're not really trying to race your opponent where the lifelink really shines, and you're not trying to win through evasion where the flying really shines. Really, I just included Atrax's Skitterfang because it's fun to give a big Trampler Death Touch, which is very doable in Golgari. And to be fair, it is the worst archetype outside of the toxic strategies of Orsov and Dimir. And since it gets picked up around 2 or 3, I usually end up passing it once I know I'm in Golgari, but hey, maybe you have one from earlier in the draft. Now for the rares. I'm going to briefly mention Archfiend of the Dross, which is best in Rakdos because of the 1-for-1 trading, and you can give it more oil counters. I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's tier S in Golgari, and its second best archetype. At least if you approach Golgari like I have been, since Golgari can play out very similar to Rakdos. Glissa Sunslayer, though, I can more confidently say is best in Golgari, and a good reason to head into Golgari if you open her up pack 1, pick 1. I put her at tier 1. I really wanted to kill a Planeswalker with her third ability, but sadly the stars just didn't line up. I've seen plenty of people attempt to splash her into other decks, but she really shines when you can cast her on turn 3. Even if you can connect only 1 or 2 times before your opponent finds an answer, it's usually enough to win through card advantage. And it's really satisfying to watch your opponent sweat when they have to decide whether to chump, block, or let you destroy an enchantment removal like Ossification or Planar Disruption. One of the things I have experienced when making the board state small through trading and removal is how great Menace is in Rakdos. Furnace Punisher becomes an absolute beating. In Golgari, though, there aren't many options for Menace. outside of Head Cleaver, which is just 2 little damage for a 4-drop. There is, however, Migloz, Maze Crusher. I was hesitant to include Migloz in my guide to Selesnya, and in the end I decided to include it, but in Golgari it's an easy inclusion. I put it at tier 1. You have a bigger curve and more time to find your red source since you can stall with your removal. And similar to Selesnya, with green you have access to cards like Armored Scrapgorger, and you don't need to worry about getting it out on turn 3. It's a 4-4, a 6-6, or an 8-8 with Vigilance and Menace, so it can apply plenty of late-game pressure and is worth including if given the opportunity. If you do decide to splash for Migloz, I'd be tempted to also include cards like Cinder/Ravager, the 5/5 Vigilance that deals 1 damage to your opponent's board, and costs less for permanents that have oil counters. I'll briefly mention Thrune, Breaker of Silence. I put it at tier 2 and have found Golgari to be its worst archetype, but it's still an easy inclusion. Black Sun's Twilight, though, if there was a card that represented Golgari, it would be Black Sun's Twilight. Can you think of a better card for mid-range removal? I put it at tier 3. I always forget that the reanimated creature comes into play tapped, which was a good design decision, because otherwise this card would be one of the best rares in the set. But oh wait, they made White Sun's Twilight. I'll briefly mention Bloated Contaminator, which is best in Selesnya because of caring about damage as well as Toxic, as well as Kaido, Dancing Shadow, which is best in Dimir and Izzet, but worth splashing if you are in blue or black. I put both at tier 3. Venerated Rot Priest is worth a mention as Golgari is its second best archetype. Again, I don't think you need to lean into the Toxic strategy, and instead can just treat this as a card that can single-handedly get your opponent corrupted, and sometimes has some fun Toxic synergies if you bump into something like Necrogen Rot Priest. I'll briefly mention Evolved Spinoderm, but it is best in Gruul because of being able to add additional oil counters, and Vron Executioner Thane, which is best in Rakdos because of trading 1 for 1. If you follow my strategy and approach Golgari like Rakdos, then I'd bump Vron Executioner Thane up to tier 2 from tier 3. Argentum Masticore is worth a mention as Golgari is its third best archetype, and it does well in a mid-range deck that wants as much removal as possible. Now for the Mythics. I'm going to briefly mention Sheoldred the Apocalypse, which I find to be best in Rakdos, but she is S tier in every black archetype, and Nissa Ascended Animist, which is best in Simic or Gruul because of ramp, but is also S tier in every green archetype. Atraxa Grand Unifier is a fun card and worth talking about in more detail. I've gotten her to work by splashing her in a Simic deck, and I was able to reanimate her in a Rakdos deck, twice actually in one match, with that emergence, to qualify for regionals in Draft Club. And it got me thinking about what 2-color archetype do I think she is actually best in, and I decided Golgari. The reason is Testament Bearer, which I like to run in Rakdos and in Golgari. Although red does give you more ways to discard Atraxa through looting within Graver or Thirst for Possibility, being able to hard cast her was nice when I was in Simic. So with Golgari, you can try to reanimate her with that emergence after milling her with Testament Bearer, but then you can also stall with removal until you can hard cast her if she ends up being in your hand. To end the last archetype of Phyrexia, All Will Be One, I'll leave you with the true dream combo. One piece of the combo is Vraska Betrayal's Sting, which is great because Golgari is her best archetype anyway. She's 2 removal in 1 card and a win condition in a pinch. But the dream is to pair her with Vorinclex, Monstrous Raider. If you have Vorinclex in play, you can slam Vraska down, getting 12 loyalty counters, allowing you to immediately ultimate and hit your opponent for 18 poison counters. I've seen it done in Constructed, but if you have a clip of accomplishing this magnificent feat in Limited, I'll make you king or queen for a day. Thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Golgari. I really hope you found the set as enjoyable as I did. Unlike many, I'm kind of sad to see it come to an end before it even reached week 12. Next week is the release of March of the Machines on April 18th, and I've started working on my overview guide, which I will be posting on April 18th as well. Thank you for taking a moment to hit like and subscribe. One day I might even qualify to play the early release. Thanks again for the support, and I'll see you next week.